Hello students, today I will be discussing about the chapter Theory of Income and Employment. This chapter is very important for the board exam, ISC. In the past, I have experienced from the past year's students that to many of them this chapter seems to be a little difficult. But I don't know why, because this chapter is completely an analytical, conceptual chapter consisting of several graphs and concepts and mathematical, little part of mathematical things are there. Anyway, now this chapter is about the theory of income and employment, how in a country's economy the equilibrium level of national income is determined. This theory, this chapter was written by John Maynard Keynes, K-E-Y-N-E-S, Keynes, and that is why this theory is called Keynesian theory. Right at the beginning, Keynes has said that aggregate demand in an economy consists of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C denotes consumption, I denotes investment, G denotes demand for various goods and services by the government, and X minus M is net exports. So the components of aggregate demand are these: consumption, investment, government expenditure for demanding or buying various goods and services, and net exports. Now then, when Keynes went into the depth of his theory, he has made two assumptions. That one assumption is the economy of the country is a closed economy. Now, if this assumption is valid, the economy is a closed economy, then the last component of aggregate demand, which is net exports, will be eliminated, because no exports, no imports if it's a closed economy. Second assumption is the government in the country does not have any role to play. If in the country the government does not have any role to play, then the third component, that is G, which is demand for various goods and services of the government, will also be eliminated. Thus, in a simplified way, in a simplified version, aggregate demand is equal to C plus I, consumption plus investment. Now, about consumption. The Keynesian consumption function, he says that consumption consists of two components. One part is autonomous consumption, and the other part is induced consumption. We can write the equation as capital letter C is equal to small a plus small c into capital Y. The first part, small a, denotes autonomous consumption. Now, what is autonomous consumption? Autonomous consumption is that consumption which exists even if income is zero. That is autonomous consumption, which remains constant. Actually, this is the basic consumption of an individual. And the induced consumption varies directly with income. Small c is a fraction, is a decimal, which is a constant number, into income. So, this induced consumption varies directly with income. It means when income increases, the second part of the consumption function, that is the induced consumption, also increases. So, this is the equation representing the consumption function, which is the Keynesian consumption function. Now, if you draw the consumption function's curve in a graph, along the x-axis we measure income, along the y-axis we measure consumption, C. Then the consumption function's curve is a flatter, gentle sloped, upward sloping straight line. Starting from the y-axis, there will be an y-intercept there. Now this y-intercept, that is, it starts from the y-axis, that distance from the origin till that point from where the consumption function starts, that distance is A, that is autonomous consumption. And then as induced consumption varies directly with income, that means when income increases, induced consumption increases. So it is upward sloping. So this is about the consumption function's curve. Then next, related to consumption, we have two concepts, APC and MPC. APC, average propensity to consume. It's a very simple equation. It's a simple formula actually. APC, average propensity to consume, is equal to C by Y. consumption expenditure divided by income. Whereas MPC, marginal propensity to consume. Marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption expenditure with respect to change in income. Here the formula is MPC is equal to delta C by delta Y, change in consumption expenditure with respect to change in income. Now, this is all about consumption functions curve and the two concepts. Next is investment. According to Keynes, investment can be of two types: planned or autonomous investment and non-planned or induced investment. According to Keynes, and this is not only according to Keynes, it's reality, that planned investment remains constant irrespective of the income. So as planned investment is autonomous, it remains constant irrespective of the income level. So this investment curve, that is the planned investment or autonomous investment curve, is a horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis. In the graph, along the x-axis we measure income, along the y-axis we measure investment. So it is a horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis. The second type of investment, which is non-planned or induced investment, varies directly with income. Sometimes people get all of a sudden unexpectedly an amount of income, a large sum of money, and then the person invests that money in buying investment goods, like buying gold, buying shares, buying a plot of land. But actually these investments are non-planned. All of a sudden it's made because that large amount of money came into the hands. So this is very uncertain. But if this investment is made, this investment's curve will be upward sloping, because when income increases, then only this type of investment increases. Now, as the second type of investment is very uncertain, so in the depth of his theory, Keynes did not consider the second type of investment, that is non-planned or induced investment. He has considered only the first type. The only first type is planned investment or autonomous investment he has considered in the depth of his theory. So the investment curve which he considers is the horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis. So we have discussed about consumption, then investment. Now aggregate demand curve, in a graph it can be derived by the summation, by the addition of consumption and investment. In the same graph, we will draw the investment curve, which is the horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis. We will draw the consumption curve, which is an upward sloping straight line starting from the y-axis. Then, if we add these two, the AD curve, aggregate demand curve, which is C plus I, will be an upward sloping straight line parallel to the C curve, parallel to the consumption curve. It will be an upward sloping straight line parallel to the consumption curve, and the gap between the aggregate demand curve and the consumption curve is a constant distance. It is a constant gap. Why? Because the difference between aggregate demand, that is C plus I, and C is I, it is investment. And as it is assumed that investment is constant, that is the planned investment, autonomous investment, that is why aggregate demand curve is parallel to the C curve. So in this way we derive the aggregate demand curve with the help of C curve and I curve. Now we come to aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve is an upward sloping straight line to the origin in the graph, making an angle of 45 degree with the x-axis. Now why is it 45 degree? Because it's obvious that aggregate supply in the economy is equal to income. What is aggregate supply? Total amount, total quantity, total volume of all goods and services which are produced and supplied in the economy by all the producers and suppliers. Now if we take into account the monetary value, the money value of all the goods and services which are produced and supplied in the economy, then actually we get the total national income in the country. That is why aggregate supply is equal to income. And that is why the aggregate supply curve is an upward sloping straight line to the origin, making an angle of 45 degree with the x-axis. Because unless it is 45 degree, we don't get aggregate supply A is equal to Y, aggregate supply is equal to income. So this is about the aggregate supply curve. Now, in order to determine the equilibrium level of income, the most stable level of income in a graph, with the help of ADAA's approach, aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach, what we'll do is, in a graph, we'll draw the investment curve, I curve, then C curve, And then with the help of I and C, we will draw the aggregate demand curve, which is the addition or summation of C and I. And then this aggregate supply curve, that is upward sloping straight line to the origin, making an angle of 45 degrees with the x-axis. And then the point where AD curve and AS curves are intersecting each other, cutting each other, intersecting each other, that point will be considered as the equilibrium point, where AD is equal to AS. Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. If you draw a perpendicular from that point, from that equilibrium point on the x-axis, that is on the income axis, then that level of income, we mark it as YF. I'll tell you why YF. Why? What is the reason? Why do we write YF? Anyway, that's YF, which is the equilibrium level of income. Equilibrium level of income is determined at that level of income at which we find aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. Okay. Now this YF, it is determined equilibrium level of income. Why is it called YF? Because according to Keynes, the man who made this theory, this YF, we denote it by YF because it denotes the full employment level of income. What is full employment situation? According to Keynes, in the economy, if all the labor resources in the country, the labor resources mainly, are eager to work at the prevailing wage rate, who are willing to work at the prevailing wage rate, are all employed. They are all employed. Then that level of employment, that situation is considered to be the full employment situation. Okay. So before that it will be unemployment. Before that it will be unemployment, because at that level of income at which aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, it will be full employment situation. But before that, what happens? Some labor resources may be there who are willing to work at the prevailing wage rate, but they are not getting jobs. So that may be unemployment situation. That is involuntary unemployment situation. But that level of income at which aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, equilibrium level of income is determined. That level of income is considered as full employment situation. Full employment level of income. Okay. Now the next thing is about savings. What is saving? That is very, very easy to know. Saving is that part of the income which is not spent on consumption. Saving is that part of the income which is not spent on consumption. So S is equal to Y minus C. Now if we draw the saving functions curve in the graph, the first part, the initial part, what we'll do is, in the graph, we'll draw the aggregate supply curve is equal to income, that curve, as income curve. The 45-degree angle line, an upward sloping straight line to the origin, making an angle of 45 degree. That will be treated as aggregate supply, that is income curve. And the consumption curve which you have learned, that is the upward sloping straight line which starts from the y-axis. It's a flatter or gentle sloped upward sloping straight line, that is the consumption curve. Then initially we find consumption curve is above the income curve. That means consumption is greater than income. So during this portion, when consumption expenditure is greater than income, saving is negative. So initially the saving is negative. Negative saving is there. Then at that point where income curve and consumption curves are intersecting each other, that means income is equal to consumption expenditure, their saving is zero. And beyond that point, to the right side of that point, we find that income curve goes above the consumption curve. That means income is greater than consumption. There, when income is greater than consumption, their saving is positive, surely, because S is equal to Y minus C. Saving is equal to income minus consumption expenditure. Saving is positive. This gives us the idea about the saving curve. Initially, the saving curve is negative below the x-axis. Then the saving curve touches the x-axis where it is 0. And after that, saving curve goes above the x-axis, upward sloping definitely. So this is the nature of the saving curve. Initially, it's below the x-axis, negative. Then it's 0, and then it's positive. So in this way, we can get the saving functions curve. Okay, after that, as we have already learned, in relation to consumption, we have two concepts, APC, MPC. Similarly, related to savings, we have also two concepts. We have two concepts, APS and MPS. APS, average propensity to save. Average propensity to save, APS. It is the savings done by the people with respect to the income, as a proportion, as a fraction of income. So S by Y, APS is equal to S by Y, savings divided by income. That is APS. Now we come to MPS, marginal propensity to save. Marginal propensity to save relates to, or it is showing the change in saving with respect to change in income. So MPS is equal to delta S by delta Y. MPS is equal to delta S by delta Y. So these are the two concepts, APS and MPS. Now, a very important topic or questions come often. Relationship between APC and APS, and also relationship between MPC and MPS. Firstly, relationship between APC and APS. Ultimately, the relationship is APC plus APS equal to 1. You can derive this relationship in a very easy way. Y is equal to C plus S. We know income is equal to consumption plus saving. Income can be split into two parts, consumption expenditure plus saving. So Y is equal to C plus S. Now if you divide this equation, entire equation, all the components of the equation by Y, then what do we get? Y by Y is equal to C by Y plus S by Y. That means Y by Y, the left side of the equation equal to sign. Y by Y is 1. On the right side, C by Y, that is APC, plus S by Y, that is APS. Thus we get, it's done. APC plus APS equal to 1. Now the next one is relationship between MPC and MPS. Ultimate relationship is again similar thing, MPC plus MPS equal to 1. And you can derive this relationship in a very similar manner. Again we'll start with the same equation, that is Y is equal to C plus S. Now we consider that there is an increase in the income by delta Y. Now we know that if there is an increase in the income by delta Y, there will be an increase in the consumption expenditure and also increase in savings. Let us assume that due to the increase in income by delta Y, there is an increase in consumption expenditure by delta C, and also there is an increase in the savings by delta S. So we can modify that equation and we can write delta Y is equal to delta C plus delta S. Now let's divide this equation, this modified equation, delta Y is equal to delta C plus delta S. Let's modify this equation, let's divide this equation by delta Y. So delta Y by delta Y is equal to delta C by delta Y plus delta S by delta Y. Delta Y by delta Y, the left side, is equal to 1, that is 1. On the right side, delta C by delta Y, which is MPC, plus delta S by delta Y, which is MPS. Thus, ultimately we get the relationship MPC plus MPS equal to 1. Now after this, we have the saving investment approach of determination of the equilibrium level of income. We have already discussed that we can determine the equilibrium level of income by using that ADS approach, aggregate demand, aggregate supply approach we have discussed. Another alternative approach of determining the equilibrium level of income is by using saving and investment. In our graph, we will draw the saving curve, which we have learned, we have discussed. Saving curve starts from the negative portion, negative y-intercept, then it remains negative initially, then it reaches 0 level, and after that it becomes positive. Then in the same graph, we will draw the I curve, investment curve. Which one? Horizontal straight line parallel to the x-axis, because according to Keynes, we consider only the planned investment, autonomous investment part. Now, according to Keynes, equilibrium is attained at that point where saving is equal to investment. That is the condition. S is equal to I. Then the point at which saving curve and investment curve, these two curves are intersecting each other, cutting each other, then that point is to be considered as equilibrium point. And the level of income at which this is attained, the level of income at which saving is equal to investment, that is to be considered as equilibrium level of income, the full employment situation level of income. Now if you consider any level of income before this point, to the left side of the point, to the left side of this point, we find saving is less than investment. That means the planned saving is less than the desired investment. Planned saving is less than the required level of saving, which will be equal to investment. So saving is less. In the whole country, people have saved less. That means they have consumed more. People's consumption definitely is more. That is why they have saved less. We know aggregate demand is equal to C plus I. Consumption is a component of aggregate demand. If consumption by the people has been more, has increased, then aggregate demand has also increased. We know at equilibrium, aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. But here we find aggregate demand has increased because consumption has increased. Then aggregate demand has increased, aggregate supply remains the same. It's excess demand situation. In excess demand situation, the producers of goods and services, the suppliers and the producers, what will they do? They will raise the prices. So producers of goods and services will raise the prices of the goods and services. That implies the income earning of the people in the country will increase. So we had considered a situation when the income was less than the equilibrium level of income. From that position, income increases, and ultimately the equilibrium level of income, where S is equal to I, where saving is equal to investment, that level is again restored or attained. We have to discuss also, along with this, the opposite situation. If we consider any level of income which is to the right side of YF, to the right side of the equilibrium point, sorry. That means that level of income at which the planned saving is greater than the desired level of investment. Here we find that in the whole country, people have saved more than the required level of saving. If people have saved more than the required level of saving, that implies consumption has been less or consumption has decreased. That is why people have saved more. Consumption has decreased. We know consumption is a component of aggregate demand. Then aggregate demand has decreased. We know at equilibrium what happens? Aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. But here aggregate demand has decreased. If aggregate demand has decreased, then aggregate supply remains the same. That is excess supply situation. Aggregate supply now is more than aggregate demand. If aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand, excess supply situation, what will the producers of goods and services do? They will reduce the price of the goods and services that they are selling. So producers of goods and services will reduce the price of the goods and services that they are producing and selling. That implies the income earning of the people will decrease. We had actually considered a level of income which was more than the equilibrium level of income. Now here, the income will decrease, and ultimately, after decreasing, the level of income will come to that level at which aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. That is a full employment situation, equilibrium level of income. Fine. Now the last topic in this chapter. The last topic is a very, very important thing. On the basis of this last thing, second last, investment multiplier. The topic is investment multiplier. Investment multiplier. Firstly, what is the concept? We assume that there is an additional investment in the country. And if there is an additional investment, because of that additional investment in the country, there is an additional income earning in the country. Then it is believed by Keynes, he has said that some multiple of the increase or additional investment is equal to the additional income earning. If we consider increase in income, delta Y, increase in investment, delta I, then we consider a multiple, a constant number, K. Delta I into K is equal to delta Y. Delta I into K is equal to delta Y. Now we can express that K, which is the multiple, the investment multiplier, is equal to delta Y by delta I. This is the basic formula of investment multiplier. The basic formula of investment multiplier. K is equal to delta Y by delta I. Okay. Now, we can derive that this investment formula, the investment multiplier formula, we can derive and write K is equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. 1 by, in the numerator 1, in the denominator 1 minus MPC, marginal propensity to consume. This is a very important proposition, very important formula to remember. Investment multiplier is equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. As we know, MPC plus MPS equal to 1. Then 1 minus MPC is equal to MPS. As 1 minus MPC is equal to MPS, so we can also write now K, that is investment multiplier, is equal to 1 by MPS. Then we have got three formula now for investment multiplier. The three formula, what these are? K is equal to delta Y by delta I. Then K is equal to 1 by 1 minus MPC. And K is equal to 1 by MPS. You can get numerical sums quite expected, very much expected. At least one numerical sum based on investment multiplier. Now, in case of investment multiplier, you can be given also the graphical representation of investment multiplier. Now, in case of the graphical representation, how to represent it? The graphical representation. See, this is the graph. Aggregate supply is equal to Y. In this picture, actually, it should be Y is equal to AS. Or you can write aggregate supply AS equal to Y, same thing, 45 degree angle line. Then AD 0 and AD 1. AD 0, initial aggregate demand, AD 0, C plus I. Then AD 1, which is the new aggregate demand after the increase in the investment. You can notice here it's written C plus I plus delta I. When we consider that there's an increase in the investment, delta I. So because of this, the aggregate demand curve increases. So there's an upward shifting of the aggregate demand curve. Okay. Now, what is the increase in income because of this? You can notice E0 is the initial equilibrium point. E1 is the final equilibrium point because AD is equal to AS again. Now, what has been the increase in income? Increase in income is from Y0 to Y1. Y0 to Y1. Then, if we denote it by delta Y, this is delta Y. And what has been the increase in investment? Delta I. You can notice the gap between the two curves, that is delta I. Now, as the angle which the aggregate supply curve or income curve makes with the x-axis is 45 degree, then in the triangle E1, E0, N, the angle E1, E0, N, angle E0, that angle is also 45 degree. Remember similar triangles. If this angle or its alternate angles, corresponding angles actually. If this angle which the aggregate supply curve makes with the x-axis is 45 degree, then this angle E0, E1, E0, N is also 45 degree, corresponding angles when we consider parallel lines and transversal. Anyway, this is 45 degree angle. Then in this triangle E1, E0, N, this angle E1, E0, N or angle E0 is 45 degree. Then, what is the increase in income? Delta Y, which is the base of this triangle, E0, N. What is the distance? Delta Y. Now, in case of a right angle triangle, if you consider the angle E1, E0, N is 45 degree, tan 45 is 1. Then if tan 45 is 1, which is perpendicular by base, so E1, N by E0, N is equal to 1. That means E1N is equal to E0N. Thus, the distance E1N is equal to E0N, delta Y, that is delta Y. But in that distance, in the perpendicular E1N, we can segregate, we can separate into two parts, E1M and MN, two parts. And in these two parts, E1M, that is the increase in investment delta I. Then E1N consists of another part Mn. So delta I plus that distance Mn is equal to delta I. Thus, delta Y by delta I, if we consider this fraction, in the numerator delta Y, which is E0N, divided by the denominator delta I, which is E1M plus Mn. That means delta I plus Mn. Thus, we find that the numerator delta I is definitely greater than the denominator, which is delta I, because delta I plus something is equal to delta Y. So we find that investment multiplier formula, delta Y by delta I is greater than 1. Delta Y by delta I is greater than 1. Okay. So about the graphical representation and the explanation based on that. Now we come to the last topic in this chapter. In this last part, we have two topics: the situation of deficient demand and the situation of excess demand. In case of deficient demand, initially the basic diagram we will draw excuse me, aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve cutting each other, intersecting each other. That gives us the equilibrium point. Also the equilibrium level of income, which is the full employment level of income, YF. And then if you consider deficient demand, then you will shift the aggregate demand curve downwards. Aggregate demand decreases, maybe decrease in consumption expenditure, maybe decrease in investment expenditure, something like that. Due to whatever reason, aggregate demand decreases. Now if in the a country's economy, aggregate demand decreases, if the aggregate demand decreases, then what happens? In the whole country, aggregate supply remains the same, but aggregate demand decreases. It will be excess supply situation. And the producers and the sellers and the suppliers, they will be reducing the prices. If they reduce the prices, then that is deflation. So this is the gap between the two demand curves, is deflationary gap. Deflationary gap. And to get rid of this situation, to get rid of this deflation, because deflation is also harmful for the economy, particularly for the producers, then for that, to get rid of the situation, the government can take certain steps to promote, to increase the aggregate demand, because aggregate demand has fallen short of aggregate supply. The government can reduce the taxes, the government can increase its own public expenditure, like these. Now this is the situation of deficient demand. You can depict in the diagram also. A very similar thing, the next topic, the last topic, which is excess demand situation, exactly opposite to this. Absolutely opposite to this. So if you can learn, if you can understand the first topic, that is deficient demand, the graphical representation, the explanation, the measures and the steps which the government can do to get rid of this, to get rid of deflation, then you can understand, you can remember also the excess demand situation. The excess demand, the gap between the two aggregate demand curves will lead to inflation, inflationary gap that is, and because of that inflation, the government feels the urgency, feels the need to do something to get rid of the situation. The government will take steps which will be exactly opposite to the steps which the government will take in case of deflation. That's it. So this is a synopsis, a summary of the whole chapter, Theory of Income and Employment. I think I can satisfy your needs about the topics and the concepts in this whole chapter. Thank you.